I've personally been reviewing games for about 3 years now, and before that, I've always been into criticism. I've been doing criticism for films for a lot longer. I've been critiquing things for a long time, but before I started to actually make reviews and put my thoughts into words, I only had ideas. Alright, and everybody has ideas. Everyone, well, that's functioning is forming ideas when they play a game or listen to music or whatnot. And we have this notion that's been passed down that something should get a score from 1 through 10, which I think is fairly reasonable. I think it's actually more than reasonable. There's a lot of people who conversely feel like you cannot represent something properly with a simple number score. And I can see where people are coming from with this. But that's honestly, it's not complete nonsense, but it is a little nonsensical because really everything can be put into words, and anything which can be articulated should be articulated. And you can't just say, we can't make sense of this painting. This painting is just it's just a jumbled mess. Whatever it makes you feel is whatever the real meaning is. I don't believe that art is subjective. I believe there are different perspectives that you might get depending on how you look at something, but as long as you can articulate yourself, then you might have something valid. But there's no such thing as everything is equally valid. If everything was equally valid, then nothing would be valid as far as I'm concerned. So there are definitely takes that you can make that are either close to the bullseye or pretty far from the bullseye. And when people saw the recent scores for Starfield, this was a game that was extremely hyped. And whenever there's a game that's super hyped, you get rabid fanboys and rabid haters. You had the people ready to shit on Starfield as soon as it got anything less than what they considered to be an average high score. So Starfield got a 7 from IGN, which I said was more like a 5 or a 6, given how they seem to really toe the line between that 7 to 10 range. I'm not the only person to point that out. I think we all know that we see a lot of 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s. There's a lot of overinflation in the video game scoring. And look, to anyone who says that you can't score a video game, we do it in everything else, alright? If you're watching MMA, they score rounds. Starting with 10 points, you take a point off for the person who loses the round. There are certain point deductions, so there is this certain logic that you start with 10, but you have to earn it. Alright, so if you do anything, I think IGN does this as soon as they start finding cons, they do their pros and cons section, and if they start tallying up the cons, then they start taking off points, and they actually do decimals. So I'm not really sure how IGN does it, but in MMA and boxing and figure skating, you get 10. You get 10, or you get 9, 8. Dave Portnoy does his pizza reviews. He likes to do decimal scores, but almost everybody is doing some kind of score. If it's movie reviews, it's usually 5 stars or 4 stars, best out of 4, best out of 5. There's always some kind of metric because I think that we all love sharing our opinions, and we love seeing if our opinions stack up with the other people who review things for a living. So it's only completely natural that there would be a lot of scores being handed out. And of course, you get people more passionate over their review scores. Oh, this got a 9 instead of a 10, or what have you. People get more passionate about review scores than they even do criticism, which could be a big problem because I do think that the written criticism carries the most weight. I think that the number score is simply a conclusion at the end point. And I'll be the first to say math is my strong suit. I look back at a lot of my reviews, and I'm mad that I gave God of War Ragnarok a 9 out of 10 when I spent most of my review taking a crap on it. It probably needed more like a 7, an 8 or a 7, because it's not a bad game. It's just not really one of the best games ever made. It has a lot of problems. God of War Ragnarok has a lot of problems, and arguably exposes a lot of the same problems of 2018's God of War. I think it's not necessarily even as good as that game. And I think there's just a lot of modern design that, at least right now, a lot of modern design aspects for games, I don't think they're going in the right direction with a lot of their fluff that they're adding to games. A lot more cutscenes, a lot more dialogue, which is superfluous dialogue. But a lot of people hated on IGN for giving Starfield what they anticipated to be the next AAA, a game that they would enjoy for a long time to come. Obviously, I thought it was overhyped because I don't think Bethesda is that good anymore. But it got a 7 out of 10, which is about IGN's average. If they're not giving a game a 10 out of 10 or a 9.9, then they're going to give it a 7. They don't typically give low scores unless... And here's the thing about critics. I think that there's honestly a circle jerk within the critics, within the critical spectrum. I think you have a lot of critics that don't write for the fans. They write for other critics to try and see who has the most flowerful prose. And yes, I do think critics arrive normally at the same consensus independently, but I also think it's because they're kind of trying to one-up the other critic. It's kind of hard to explain, but I think some critics will be the outlier, the contrarian, just because they want to maybe grab some attention. You know, like if Elden Ring comes out, gets 10s across the board, you're going to have someone who's going to give Elden Ring like a 7. They're just going to... Either they didn't like the game or they just want some extra attention, like, oh, let me go read this guy's review. Why did he give it a low score? Or the opposite could be true if it was a game that scored pretty low. But the problem with review scores is I think almost nobody actually knows why they give a game a score. This is kind of my long-winded intro into... I came up with my scale several years ago. I came up with my scale. I have a scale 1 through 10, solid numbers, but there's a criteria for each one. And I try to be very, very strict and only give out high scores to games that really deserve it. Games that check all the boxes. Games that not only I personally enjoy, but, really fall in love with. And games that have no inherent, glaring issues whatsoever. You have to be perfect, and well, perfect is the word that... Let's not use perfect, because it's hard for anything to be perfect. If everything was perfect, then there would be no evolution, there'd be no innovation. But you have to be exemplary, all right? You have to be very, very good in every category. I can't find any category that, oh, this is kind of boring, this is kind of distasteful. No, every aspect needs to be amazing. And then to me, it has to also dare to take another step, dare to do something that we've never thought of before, something we've never seen before. And it has to do something, it has to excel at least one aspect in particular beyond what the standard set by something else has been. So just when you take a look at IGN, to their credit, they do have a page where they try to give you some sensibility about why they review and give scores that they do. And they do have some examples. Actually interesting taking a look at it now. They do have at least a few examples. So they did give Fallout 76 a 5. And I didn't play Fallout 76, but I mean, see, it's very rare that they decide to go down through the scale. Some of these games at the bottom I don't recognize. They actually have given a few games a 1. So honestly, looking at this scale that they have, it isn't... I have to give them credit for at least having something like this. You would expect that to be the bare minimum. They do have some reasoning here, very, very little. But the problem with reviewers at these publications is what Video Game Donkey pointed out a long time ago, which is that the people that review games at IGN or GameSpot, unless you're one of their longtime readers and you actually make sure to pay attention to who has their name on the credits. And by the way, they obviously have editors at IGN and GameSpot, so they're not 100% written by the person, which is why I would never want to work at a place like that without control. But a lot of these publications, it's a revolving door of columnists. You don't know who is going to be writing the review. I think they started doing video reviews. I think they've been doing very, very simple, half-assed video reviews for a while, but I don't know that they do one for every single review that they write. I don't think IGN does multiple reviews for a single game. So you're getting a different voice almost every single time, unless depends on the publication. So you get a different voice every single time, and for this reason, as Video Game Donkey pointed out, it's a very decentralized process. It's not the same as if you go and you're awaiting the latest review from Yahtzee at zero punctuation. You know what you're going to get with him. Okay, you know he's going to have some banter. He's going to be very sarcastic, most likely. And if he isn't, like, you get to know how a reviewer articulates themselves. You get to know their sense of humor, their taste, what they like. And so that puts into perspective when they actually do like a game. When Donkey actually likes a game, it's hard to tell with him because he's very much of a troll. He's very sarcastic. But when he does like a game, you can tell. You can tell when he takes it seriously. And not to say that he's not providing insight, sometimes even being a troll, but you can tell when Yahtzee likes something. The way he talks about it will change. His tone of voice will change, and he'll take out some of the jokes. Like, both of these guys like Persona 5, which to me is universally, how can you not like Persona 5? Even for people who don't like RPGs, Japanese RPGs, if you will. People like Persona 5 because it's that good. It's kind of self-explanatory. But anyway, to get to my real point, my original scale, I tried to put some more math behind the way that I judge games 1 through 10, or even movies for that matter, because a lot of it ends up being by emotion. A lot of it ends up being emotion if you don't have a rubric, which sounds very stupid, it sounds very nerdy, it sounds pretentious, but you have to have some criteria to judge something on. Okay, like I said, in all seriousness, you watch MMA, there's so many scores in MMA that are almost objectively wrong. All right, some of it's subjective, but some of these scores are almost objectively wrong because by the very criteria, a lot of these guys are losing fights that they end up winning. So you have to have some criteria. So we'll start at 1. So once upon a time when I was reviewing other scripts, doing some networking with other writers and reviewing screenplays, we were given some tips for how to approach giving criticism back to someone. And it was from Francis Ford Coppola, actually, who on his website said, I don't think I've ever come across a script that's a 10, and I've probably never come across a script that's a 1. So those are the two outliers, obviously, on either extreme of the scale. But 1, I don't know if I've ever played a game that's a 1, but, I get creative with my scale. So 1 is the lowest form. All right, this is just a funny term I came up with. You've got high form, which is like an 8. Low form, lowest form, I say it's worthless, barely functioning at all. And a game that's barely functioning at all, and a game that just doesn't have any redeeming qualities, like Cyberpunk, barely functioned at all. But Cyberpunk wasn't worthless. Cyberpunk actually did have a good game when you can get around the bugs to play it. So I would never give something like Cyberpunk a 1. I haven't come across a 1 since playing games. But if it's really, really shit, then you get a 1 out of 10. A 2 would be horrendous, so a little bit better than a 1, but just utter and absolute trash, just a terrible game, right? So not quite worthless, but really, really bad. Which still, by the way, doesn't say too much, but I'm going to get into how I am going to start assigning points from here on out. What kind of boxes need to be checked off with articulation to get a good score. So 3 is just bad. Now, I gave a 3 out of 10 to Forspoken's story. I didn't give a 3 out of 10 overall. I gave it a 5. But I thought it was just really bad. It was just trash, garbage, kind of self-explanatory. Forspoken's writing was not very good. I didn't care about really any of the characters or what was happening, so I gave it a 3. And a 4, I'll give you an example. When I played Red Dead 2 online, to me that was a 4. Bottom of the barrel. Mediocre, adversely affected. What was wrong with Red Dead 2 Online? Too many microtransactions, a lot of bugs. It turns out that you take that single-player experience, which is pretty enjoyable up to a certain point, you turn that into an online. All you can do is ride your horse around. There's no cars, there's no airplanes. The guns aren't very exciting. You took the model that you had with GTA 4 and GTA 5 Online. It just was not going to work with a Wild West setting. The mini games weren't too interesting. Red Dead Online was just bad. It was dead on arrival, and the developers didn't care. So because some of the gameplay was okay, but not enough to keep me playing, to me that's like a 4 out of 10. So it is possible to have something like that. And then 5, we need to start putting games in the 5 to 7 range instead of the 7 through 10 range. So 5 is slacking, lackluster, on the fringe of being like decent, because Forspoken had some okay gameplay mechanics if you actually got to the point that you could give a shit about them. But because the story was so bad, you could never get to a point where you would actually want to play Forspoken. So that was the problem. And I've given a few sixes before. I gave a game that everybody pretended that they loved, but was really just an average game. What was that game? Stray. I gave Stray a 6 out of 10. I gave Ghostwire Tokyo a 6 out of 10. And I'm not sure if I've given something else a 6 out of 10, but there's probably some games that I would move down to a 6. There's a couple of games that, I'm guilty of it too. I've given some 7s out before to games that didn't really need them, but I'm going to start giving a lot more 6s. I think 6, to me, 6 is average. To me, 6 is playable. You won't vomit in your mouth going through it. You might get a good, if it has trophies, almost every game has trophies. Might as well play a 6 out of 10 if you get stuck with it, but I would never recommend a 6 out of 10. I would only recommend games that get 7 and above, and 7 at the lowest. But 7 is a game it's okay. I think it's slightly, ever so slightly above average. It's a fine game. It's respectable, but it's not something that you'd probably come back and play after you beat it. And all the other games you probably maybe shouldn't even play at all unless you get stuck with it, reviewing games or something of that nature, or you want to get an easy platinum. So I've given a lot of 7s, but again, like, probably I have to reevaluate some of the 7s that I gave. I gave Callisto Protocol a 7. I gave Battlefield 2042 a 7, which was at launch, and I was in the honeymoon phase, so that's probably more like a 5, because that game really is hit or miss. I don't think it was a 7. I'd probably give Cyberpunk like a 7 in retrospect. I think that would be a fair score. I did give The Last of Us 2 a 7. I did give The Last of Us 2 a 7, but looking back, that's probably more like a 5 out of 10, which is what I hate about review scores of the game. Like, The Last of Us 2 could get the most awarded game of all time or some nonsense. There's no way that the consensus of critics really thought the game was a 9 out of 10. Like, what is that game doing with like a 94 on Metacritic when something like Bloodborne has like a 91? And that's a PlayStation exclusive, by the way, which, maybe would be higher if some of the Souls fans on PC got to play it, for instance. But we can all sit here and argue about scores for games, but it's the consistency that matters, and it's the honesty that matters. And there's no way that The Last of Us 2, yeah, on a technical level, the game is pretty polished, but then that's where all of the ideological issues come in, and all of the blatant plagiarism that comes in. And plagiarism is one thing, but when you're doing things that are a legitimate downgrade from games from, a whole decade before, that's an issue. But anyway, so when we start to get to 8 out of 10, these are the scores that really they have to be earned. We need to be very, very, very careful, very, what's the word? I don't know. We need to be very meticulous with the way we hand out these very high scores. So for me, a good game, I came up with good game, because when I started playing games, GG was something you said. Everybody who grew up playing games in the 2000s, somebody would tell you GG, and that either means get good, or it means good game. It usually means good game or good gaming. So to me, I keep it simple. If it's an 8 out of 10, if it's really a solid, good game, high form, if it's a top tier and distinguished game, an 8 out of 10 is a really good score. So I've given a lot of 8 out of 10s, maybe being a little bit too generous, but I think Returnal was an 8 out of 10. Just barely, because Returnal was a solid game. Interesting concept, third-person roguelike procedural game. Had an interesting character, interesting mythos to it. I thought that it took some challenges for a relatively small studio game. I thought it had a pretty good gameplay. Not perfect, So I'm not giving it too high of a score. Definitely some issues with it. But probably a solid 8 out of 10. Or Demon Souls. I gave Demon Souls an 8 out of 10, which is the highest that game deserves, because it's not Bloodborne. So it's not all of the games that came later that really do deserve close to perfect scores. Demon Souls, I give it an 8 for what it meant in 2009. Maybe giving it a little bit of, not legacy, but a little bit of heritage. Might get it a bit higher for me, even though I don't think that should be done with every game. But if it's a solid game, enjoyable, not one of the best games ever made, but definitely memorable, maybe give it an 8 out of 10. Now, for me, the way I look at things, a great game is a 9 out of 10. And you can throw some other superlatives in there. But a game that's really astonishing, like very close to a 10, but there's definitely at least one major thing holding it back. And to me, BioShock, the BioShock games, to me, those are classic 9 out of 10 games. You would swear that BioShock was a masterpiece. The opening sequence is a masterpiece, but the rest of the game dips off. Some peaks and troughs in that game. When I finally got to play BioShock, I really was very satisfied with it, but as I got to thinking about it, I thought to myself, no, I don't think I'd give that a 10 out of 10. I think I'd give it a 9 out of 10. Solid 9. No argument. You couldn't give BioShock anything less than 9. In my opinion, I don't think it could get anything less than a 9, but I don't think it's a 10. I think that's a bit of a stretch. Definitely one of the best games out there. I think the same with DMC4. Not quite a masterpiece, because it does have some issues, but solid 9. Solid 9 out of 10. Extravagance, the word that we use that I think is the difference. A game that tries so much, maybe too much, but doesn't quite nail the landing on some of the things it's trying, but still an exceptional game. Alright, so 9s, we see so many games getting a 9. People just, oh, it's a really good game, it's a 9. I'm not going to give it a 10, but it's a 9 just to placate people. Last of Us 2 is not a 9, alright? Some of these games, not a fucking 9, alright? I don't think Ragnarok is a 9. Even something like Persona 5 Strikers, which I gave a 9 at the time, or Ghost of Tsushima, Ghost of Tsushima, alright, something like that. A little Japanese pronunciation on it. You gotta pronounce the T. I don't think Ghost of Tsushima is a 9, because there's some real issues with the open world activities, the writing, the quest lines. But, the graphics, 10 out of 10 graphics, 10 out of 10 art style, to me, push it over to a 9. But no, that's not the way it works. That's probably like an 8 at best. Persona 5 Strikers probably an 8 at best, because it's not the real Persona 5. I don't think that's as good as Catherine, or nowhere near Persona 5, which is, let's go ahead and talk about a 10. Okay, a masterpiece reserved for the game changers. And this sounds pretentious as hell, but it's kind of tongue-in-cheek. If you can't say something is an unforgettable, earth-shattering masterpiece, unforgettable, earth-shattering experience, you don't have a 10 out of 10. If it's not phenomenal, extraordinary, and the next level of the evolution of art, okay, that's not a 10. All right, so what really gets a 10? Let me just, I've been here for a while. Let me look at my new rubric. My new rubric for scoring. So at first I thought about weighted scoring. I thought about giving one component more credit than another component, which I'm not really sure if I'm going to do that. But I think the best case scenario would be if I'm talking about a game. Some games are just story driven. Alright, so some games are story driven. You kind of have to gauge them a little bit differently, because they're not trying to maybe do all the other things that a big budget, like if it's Metal Gear Solid, it kind of is a story driven game, but you're definitely going to judge it for what kind of stealth, what kind of cool shit can you do in Metal Gear Solid, right? So what can you do in Metal Gear Solid 5 that makes it justify being an open world game? There's a lot of stuff you can do. Alright, so it doesn't skip on the gameplay. And that's another game I'd probably give a 9 out of 10 too. I feel very strongly about MGS5. Not quite a masterpiece. Like a lot of people, there are certain aspects of the game that seem a little bit uneven with the storytelling and mission structure and that kind of thing. But such a good story, such good gameplay, everything else. Close close to a masterpiece, not quite a masterpiece. It doesn't quite do that extra something to get it over the hump. But some games are story driven, like Stray was a story driven game. I still gave it a 6 out of 10 because I didn't think that the story was very good. If it had been a really good story, then I might have said, okay, gameplay is terrible, but it's not trying to do gameplay so much. So some of these other components, it's not going to get all the points. But if it had a strong narrative, I would give it all the points for narrative. And if it's a game like Mario, I'm never going to judge a Mario game for not having a great story. I'm not going to say that's precluded from being a masterpiece, because what is there is so fundamental. You know, saving the princess. At least it handles its story. At least it has iconic characters, which is rare to have iconic characters that don't even say a word half the time. Mario has 10 out of 10 characters. The story, probably not 10 out of 10, but I'm not going to actually hold that against it. That's a special case where I'm just going to look at the gameplay, look at the music, art style, perfect across the board in pretty much every Mario game. How could it not be? It's the original game. So that's maybe a time where I'll have some exceptions to the rule. But in every other case, we're scoring games 1 through 10. You get a point maximum for each category out of 10 categories. So that's how you end up with the 10-point scale. So we start with narrative. So the category is narrative, but it's divided into 3 components. There's the writing, which I think is the general. What kind of writing style is used? What kind of punctual dialogue is there? Right, there's a difference between just general writing, and there's actually a big difference between plot and story. The story is what happens. The plot is how it happens. All right, the story is actually quite dynamic, but the plot is starting on let's say in a galaxy long ago, far far away. That's the plot. All right, so from point A to point B, how does the story move forward? You could describe a plot very mundanely. The example I always used was the story of The Godfather is how Michael Corleone transformed into The Godfather, how he took the place of Vito, how Michael Corleone outsmarted all of his enemies and became the king. But the plot is, one day on 1945, there was a wedding, and all these people showed up and blah, blah, blah. So the plot isn't so interesting, but the story is what gets you interested in the moment to moment. Story is more of direction, and I'm not here to explain all of that, but just how do I score it? How surprising, gripping, and exciting is the plot, all right? Are there good plot twists that make sense, that don't have too many plot holes? Are there twists and turns that make me pleasantly surprised in the story? Is there a point in the story where I get gripped, where I can't wait to see what happens next? All right. How exciting does it make me feel? Is it inspiring like Persona 5? Or is it like a maybe Nier or something? Or Silent Hill that's a little bit depressing but causes you to reflect? Not to say that Persona 5 doesn't, or that an inspiring work causes you to reflect too, introspection maybe. But does it get me on either one of those extremes? And then how inventive is the narrative? How complex is the narrative? If it's a very simple narrative, like something like Mario, then okay, maybe I'm not going to be over the moon about it. But is it at least effective? Does it use literary devices? How does it frame the story to set itself apart? Is it effective in telling the story? Is it effective in moving the plot forward? How clever and punctual being the timing. How is the comic timing? How is is it a very verbose kind of dialogue? How witty is the dialogue? And how witty is the symbolism? All right, so are you using Chekhov's gun? Are you putting an element, like, I don't want to spoil, but Persona 5 is one of my games that I use as a measuring stick. So if you played Persona 5, then you can start to think about how that game is going to get points in every category, all right? It's going to get all the credit in all 3 categories for having excellent writing, excellent plot, and excellent story. I have this asterisk here. Story is not worth more or less than any other individual component, but it's scrutinized carefully according to what the story is trying to accomplish. And of course, I did say that there might be a time where there's weighted scoring, but I'll get to that in a little bit later. So of course I think that characters are separate from the narrative, because if not, then the issue is you might get a game that has great characters but the plot's not so good, like Bayonetta. Bayonetta's plot is very basic. There's not anything too exceptional going on in the plot, but I'm not going to take points away from that because the characters are pretty much 10 out of 10. And with what story is there, it is kind of charming. There is some character development, which is probably the main thing that you need to have at some point. But I actually think that not necessarily on that front. What I care about with characters, how well do the characters fit in their own story? Does the story outshine the main character? Is the main character outshined? Which sometimes it'll happen if you have an ensemble cast. But how much does the main character fit in its own story? How much influence does the main character actually have on the narrative? Because if you're going to be the protagonist, then it somewhat needs to revolve around you. And you as the player, how much do you have to say and how the world changes? How much do you, the player, have in creating the character? How much say do you have? How much agency do you have? How much personality does each character have? And the characterization, the most important thing. Which, how do you explain characterization? It's not what you say, it's how you say it. Simplest way to explain that. Not what you say, how you do it. Not what you do, how you do it, not what you say, how you say it. So Dante, greatest example of characterization by far in video games. You just watch the first cutscene with Dante and Devil May Cry 3. It's not what he's doing, it's how he's doing it. Alright, he's not going too over the top. He's getting up there. He's going crazy. But it's actually not how much he does, it's the simplicity in his mannerisms. It's what that actually says about him. It's a character. He's not just to show off, alright? It's the opposite. It's everything he touches turns to shit. Incredibly powerful, and we'll get to how that can be used in gameplay elements later. So how memorable, for the right reasons, are the protagonists and antagonists and everyone in between? You don't want to end up with an Abby from Last of Us 2. So how memorable are the characters for the right reasons? So are they affable? And do they complement one another in the story's themes? And do they complement each character in and of themselves? So if the story is about romance, is the relationship believable? Are the sacrifices authentic? Do these things need to happen to move the plot forward? And would these characters, given what we know about them to that point in the story, is that the authentic way that they would behave? Do they have unique and compelling qualities which distinguish them, not only in the realm of video games, but in general? In the sense you're excited to continue playing as them through them. So do you have a character in the first couple hours of the story that has some development that you can see as the flagship for the franchise? So, Sly Cooper, right away, Sly Cooper has enough to carry the game. We know Dante can carry the game. We know Leon can carry the game. Even recently when I've been playing Witcher 3, Geralt's a pretty strong character. He has a pretty strong cast. I would probably give that a pretty high score on characters. How much do you, the player, contribute to the world events unfolding? Same thing with RPGs in particular. Is it just watching cutscenes and whatever happens, or do you have some choice along the lines? Now, you don't have to hit every single component that I'm listing, but as long as you do well in the main categories, which I think are pretty much applicable everywhere, then you'll get full credit for the category. If your characters are customizable to an extent, if they have personality, if they have good characterization, if they're memorable, then you'll get full credit for having good characters. How entertaining or insightful is their interplay? So especially in text games, RPGs, story-driven games like Persona, how good is the dialogue between the characters? Are their interactions meaningful? Are they funny? Are the writers just putting too much fluff just to be superfluous? That matters, okay? Because you want to simulate lifelike interactions that are believable, and you also maybe want to show us some things that are beyond our imagination. You have to be very talented to put the player and the characters in a situation that we wouldn't imagine on our own. That's very interesting. So are the characters fascinating enough for me to pretty much do my own fan fiction? All right, are the characters good enough for a sequel to imagine? What I wonder what they're doing right now in their own fictional world. Wonder what Superman's doing right now. Wonder what Bruce Wayne's up to. That kind of thing. These are all the considerations to arrive at the conclusion that you have good characters. Alright, so you have three categories. I'm judging in three main categories that are bold, and if they check off all the boxes, then I'm giving a whole point. Alright, so you got 1 point there. So I always confuse gameplay, I always use gameplay interchangeably with combat, but there's the distinction between the combat and the other things you do in the world. So gameplay is in two categories, but they both get a point. I have an asterisk that says that when and where necessary, gameplay can be worth more. So those are the games that aren't really trying to tell much of a story, so we don't really have to talk too much about the narrative. And also games that have kind of a silent protagonist. You can get away with having a silent protagonist. You can get away with Mario and Luigi because the gameplay is so good. We're not going to really judge them. We can judge them kind of how we can maybe judge them for characterization. Can't really apply those other categories, but if the gameplay is like 10 out of 10, then I'm willing to basically give it credit for the things it's not even trying to do, so I can't really judge it for those anyway. So gameplay can be worth more, but never less than another category. So what is good combat? I'm looking for combat variety, combat cohesion, and what I think is equally important as good gameplay physics, you need to have good encounter design and good enemy design. So does the combat allow for personal expression, which is transformative? Can you have different play styles that allow you to be dynamic with the way you play, with the potential to fundamentally change how the game could be experienced? Are the combat physics enthralling? Are they dynamic and strategic? How well do the core mechanics mesh and balance out with the encounter design and the boss design? Because it takes two to tango. You get a game like Devil May Cry 5 has some of the best physics ever, alright? In some ways improves from 3 and 4, but doesn't have the best level design. Those levels aren't very fun to play. And then you have, and that's just looking at Nero and Dante, not even talking about the levels that shouldn't be in there with V. But the bosses are not the best in Devil May Cry 5, and I don't think that the levels are the best either, or the encounters, or the scoring system, but that's a whole other topic. But is there combat variety? So can you express yourself through the combat, alright? Is the combat just press the same two buttons, or do you have combos? Do you have some degree of depth through the combat, and does it all work together? Alright, do the different components like Neo 2 is an action RPG, one of the best games ever made, and especially in terms of its combat, flat out 10 out of 10 combat, 10 out of 10 gameplay, so many different intricate systems that are intertwined, the thought that they put into that and the way that they actually made it all work, because sometimes you'll get some shit like Elden Ring where you have the most variety out of any Souls or any From Software game, but some of the builds, at least when the game came out, did not seem to work optimally. I don't think they had coded in everything or thought of everything. So how well is there cohesion and encounter design and enemy design? Again, just think Devil May Cry with how Devil May Cry does encounters. It's about problem solving and puzzle solving. And then, are the enemies fun to fight? And how, like Devil May Cry, once again, using different colors for different types of enemies. Different indicators, or there are different things you can do depending on different strategies for fighting different enemies, different things you can do using the physics. Right? Some enemies maybe you can toss them up in the air, some enemies maybe you can't, maybe you have to dance around them. Enemy design and counter design, where it's applicable, which is why open world games, it's hard to judge them for their combat because they usually don't have good encounter design, because usually the encounters are so randomized that they don't really think that through. And then activities, which is a little bit more broad, but what kind of quest lines, what kind of collectibles are the collectibles interesting? Like, at least in Witcher 3, there's only one collectible, and it's Gwent. Get all the Gwent cards and play Gwent while you're doing it. That's actually a pretty good collectible. Activities like in Yakuza, you get to go watch adult videos, let's say, in Yakuza. You don't see that in any other game. So what kind of original activities can you do? What is there to do in the world that will allow you to enjoy your stay and make you want to come back for more? What can you do in this game that you couldn't enjoy as much, or maybe even more than you could in real life or in another medium? So what's more interesting about this is a game as opposed to a movie or music or whatever, TV show? What can you do here that inspires you to get out and try something new? So, is there so much atmosphere that you wish you could go and see? Wish you could go to Japan or wherever. I might have to. I got to think about what I mean by Easter eggs, but I think I know what I mean, but I just can't quite articulate it. Perhaps that is like references to other games, and I suppose it's. I suppose Easter eggs is more of a how you tie the game into the greater universe. So in like Yakuza, there's so many different games, or GTA, there's so many different games. How well do you tie the different worlds together and make you feel like you're in that universe as opposed to just some random game? Maybe that's what I mean. So activities, more or less, what can you actually do in the game outside of just fighting enemies? And so now we have music, which I'm giving it its own category because I think music is that essential. I think music is that important. You have how well can you get the mood across? How well can you create the atmosphere? And how well do the themes match the music? And how does the music match the themes? This video is getting long, so I'm just going to explain what I ultimately mean by the criteria. Is it memorable? Can I play the music over and over again and the stimulus doesn't fade away? Is it evocative? Does it bring out different emotions in me, different moods? Is it eclectic? Is there a wide variety of different sounds, instruments, different types of music, different genres, like a Devil May Cry 3, which has electronic music, it has screamo, it has rock and roll, it has orchestral pieces. Is it like Persona 5, where 1 minute it's a jazz soundtrack, then it's pop, then it's rock, then it's like like so many different experimental soundtracks? Is there a wide variety of good music, not just one song that I'll play over, but multiple songs? Does the music coalesce? Does the music give meaning to the story, and does the story give meaning back to the music? So, 4 different criteria. I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to judge some of these based off of do they have to hit every single box to get full credit or just maybe 3 out of the 4. I think maybe 3 out of the 4. And I don't believe in rounding up, I believe in rounding down. So you either get credit for it or you don't, since I'm doing a solid number score. But music is one of those things. It's either hit or miss because it's about making you emotional. But if you can explain the themes through the music, then you can get close to understanding whether it actually fits or doesn't. Then we have art style as separate from world design. Art style is pretty much, how much personality, how distinct is the color, the shapes of the world? How alive does it make you feel that the world is? Or how dead, like Bloodborne? Bloodborne's aesthetic is very dark and mysterious and kind of batshit. So how alive or dead does the world look? And what kind of approach was the artist going for? If it's a minimalist approach, then I kind of need everything to be detailed. And if it's a maximalist approach, same thing, honestly, like Persona 5. How much detail did they put into even the small parts? That's what I'm looking for. If it's minimalist, I'm looking for everything to sort of pop out at me. And if it's maximalist, I'm at least looking for some kind of detail where I wouldn't expect it. I'm gonna look for the places the opposite of what they're trying to do, if that makes sense. So I care about detail, the originality, and the flair. Alright, now this is kind of subjective. At the same time, it's not too objective. You look at Persona 5, that's a 10 out of 10 art style. You look at Bloodborne, can't really argue with that. I'm looking for some originality, detail, and some kind of personality that sets it apart. And I'm putting that distinct from graphics, because graphics are always going to get better up to a certain point. So I'm looking for how distinct does something look. BioShock still looks very good, even though it's from 2007. Alright, because it's got that art style. Then we got world design, which is simply where can I go, what can I do, Is every location worth exploring? Are there some locations that are boring, that are just there to pad the space? Is there space between the space? Meaning, when you're walking in an open world, something like Death Stranding or whatever it might be, if it's empty, then is there at least some kind of atmosphere? Is there something going on that doesn't quite meet the eye? If I'm just walking through the world, am I at least getting good sights like Ghost of Tsushima? Every single biome is beautiful, so at least I feel like I can enjoy myself when there's nothing much to do. Is there space in between the space? How much space is in between the space? It's just empty space. Like GTA 5, you have Los Santos, and then you have a big fucking desert, which there isn't much to do. But since it's a sandbox game, you can always meet up with other people and figure something out. Very simple. Is there immersion? Persona 5. Immersion all the way. If there's not immersion, then that's not a good thing. Then that's not great world design. So we need to have. And then lastly, how well is the gameplay integrated into the surroundings? So if it's a platformer, how good do the platform mechanics match the world design? Do the mechanics appear often enough inside the game to warrant their inclusion? Is there something that is put into the game that shouldn't be there because you're never going to use that mechanic again? All right, so that's the world design, kind of a combination of the gameplay mechanics and how do they fit in the overall world and how interesting is the world. So practicality, like, is the world, is it too big for the sake of being big? Like, how easily can I fast travel between points? How well are the different points interconnected, like in Resident Evil 4 or even the remake? Once you unlock the shortcuts, that's practical design because you can just zip from one point to the next instead of taking the long route. How distinctive is the world? How immersive is it? And how unique is it to the point where there's some activities to do in that world that I can't find in any other game, like GTA 5 or something. Even Red Dead, which isn't as good as a game, but there's some things you can do in Red Dead that you can role play as you can't do in another game. What I think is very important is replay value and progression. So these two things go together because if I'm judging a multiplayer game, it's all about the replay value. There's nothing else to consider. It's just all about the replay value. If it's an online game, it's all about what can you do to come back and play it again. Because the experience doesn't change that much. Maybe if it's a live service game, it's going to be the same core gameplay. So how addictive is that gameplay? And what kind of progression system, which isn't microtransaction, that's not a progression system, what can you unlock? What kind of stat tracking is there? And if it's a single player game, are there different endings? Are there character upgrades that you can only achieve through replaying the game? Enough to incentivize replaying the game. If it's Devil May Cry 3, then it's all about getting the ranking for the missions. And some new unlockable stuff. If it's Resident Evil 4, you can get the upgrades and you carry those to New Game Plus, and then you can experience the game again in a variety of different ways once you've got all the different weapons and gadgets and so on. So it does offer a different experience, and because the core mechanics are so addicting, it doesn't get old. So I'm judging on timeless quality. Does the game ever get old after a certain amount of time, or is the game always good? There's nothing that feels worse. Maybe there's something that feels better, but nothing that feels worse the more you play it. How much depth is there to the design and all the different facets? And is the difficulty or the challenge, because that's the main reason for playing a video game is a challenge usually, is the challenge by design, by good design, and not by some artificial inflation metric, like just bad RPG scaling? Is it difficulty by using skill, requiring skill, or is it just bad design? If it's bad design, then it's going to lose some points there. Then we have game direction and synergy. Now this one is kind of hard to explain, but I'm going to explain it with the term ludonarrative dissonance, which I don't think is the best term. Nobody really knows what it means. But there was one guy on YouTube, I forget what his name is, that was another small creator who made a great point. He used Devil May Cry 3, which you can use as pretty much the benchmark for just about anything in gaming. But he talked about how ludonarrative dissonance is an aspect of that game but it's the opposite of what people usually use it for. So normally people think of the Uncharted games where Nathan Drake is supposed to be the hero, but he's actually killing more people than the bad guy. So that's a little bit of a dissonance with how you're supposed to view the character versus how he actually behaves. But that's actually kind of the main selling point of a video game, which is you have like Dante, he's a superhero, he's so overpowered, he's more powerful than you could ever be. So the challenge is when you get handed the controller, how can you use your talents and use your skill and what the game provides you to try and replicate what you see in the cutscenes and the non-playable cutscenes. You see how amazing Bayonetta is. Can you pull off Bayonetta's moves better than Bayonetta? Can you pull off Dante's moves better than Dante? And game direction is, does the video game coalesce into a kind of piece of art that's unlike anything else? There's nothing like Resident Evil 4. Unlike any game that ever was made before or since. There's nothing like Devil May Cry 3. That's a unique brand. Bayonetta is a unique brand. Metal Gear Solid is a unique brand. So this is kind of the not really uniqueness, but I'm looking at how good is the game direction. This is kind of factoring everything else, but I'm thinking about ultimately, does this video game really set itself apart from all the other different mediums? Is this in its core a video game, an experience that you can only find in a game, and how well do they use everything at their disposal to make it obvious to the player, all right, that this is a game, and at least a portion of the narrative is told through your choices. That's what I'm looking for, what I call sublimation. The act of impressing upon the player that they themselves can tell a portion of the story through the choices made through gameplay alone. And the other half is vision. I'm looking for how visionary a game was. When you look at BioShock, one of the most amazing concepts for a world and for a story ever in a video game, right? We all understand this. We all understand that BioShock 10 out of 10 concept might not be 10 out of 10 execution, but the vision part is there. All right, for example, that's kind of a complicated category, but I understand what I mean by that. So I'm looking at how well does this video game let you know it's a video game all the way through, and how distinct is it from every other type of video game? Because if video games aren't distinct, if every game is just a copy of another game, then it could be. You could definitely have games that are very similar. They're also excellent, but I need them to be distinct in some meaningful way. And so this is how, if you get all the credit throughout all those categories, there's one final category, which has to be there, because there's nothing wrong with a 9 out of 10. That's one of the best games ever made. If you actually get a true 9 out of 10, if you do everything else well, story, characters, world design, art design, music, activities, combat, replay value, progression, overall game design. If you do everything well, you might get a 9 out of 10 if there are no glaring faults throughout that process. But to be a 10 out of 10, you gotta be a 9 plus 1. All right, it's not just 9 plus 1. It's, do you do everything well? And then do you do something that no one else does? Because every game that I can think of that's a masterpiece, or a movie that's a masterpiece, it does something that no one else has even thought of before. Okay, there's nothing like Persona 5 in a video game. I played more RPGs since Persona 5, and you got a lot of these games that add up the runtime. You got a lot of games that are like 100, 150 hours to play, but that main story is 100 hours minimum. That's not counting all the other things you can do, but it's about the atmosphere. It's about the way that the narrative is told. It's about how these activities match. They combine in a way that allows you to, like Neo, I said, there's so many different mechanics that you wouldn't know actually are not just there to take your time. They actually they augment the gameplay in some way. And then just the combination of music and art style and all these things, it does everything so well on its own. You might as well give it a 10 out of 10. But the synergy, this is about synergy, the synergy of all these different parts And then, without getting into spoilers, just the themes, how daring those themes are. Uh, we never thought that a video game narrative could be that. That you could spend 100 hours and still tell a story. You can't do that in a movie, can't do that in any other medium, maybe not even a TV show. 100 hours of character development leading up to that. Okay, that is legacy and innovation. Does the game polish any potential genre elements through refinement or augmentation? Can any one particular element be considered the peak of the genre? So, in order to be a masterpiece, if it's that good, a game must not only be exemplary in every possible facet of design, it must also go beyond and dare to do something that has never been done before, or indeed even thought up before. It must have perfect synergy among all parts of the whole and inspire the way forward for the next generation of gaming. Alright, so Resident Evil 4 invented something new. It invented a whole damn camera angle. It did things that no one has ever thought of before. Devil May Cry, Devil May Cry 3 did things that no one ever thought of with characterization, with motion capture and cutscenes, with its story, with its freedom of expression through gameplay. That was an innovation from not even just the first two games of the series, but that was really coalescing everything together and showing us how a game should be. A game like Resistance Fall, man, people think Halo was this, that, and the other. Resistance took that gameplay, refined it, expanded it at the same time. Bit of a paradox, but it refined all the things that Halo did well. Then it gave you more things to do, more weapons to use. Then, as a multiplayer game, had the greatest progression system, showed us how to do a progression system in a multiplayer game, and then connected all these different people together on the internet, which had been done before, but not in a way where you're playing with all the different servers in one. That was something unique that Sony did. Because every other game you're just playing within your own region. No, on that game you're playing with people from all over. Those are just some examples. Games that are pretty much just as good as you can be in every single category. Then it's the synergy or one concept in particular that's like, whoa, we've never thought of doing that before. So Masterpiece is not only 9 plus 1, it's a whole greater than any individual sum could be, no matter how great the individual parts standalone are. And perhaps nothing is perfect, yet that which can be said to be so satisfactory that you wouldn't change it in and of itself is good enough to fit the bill. So you might come up with an idea for a sequel, and hopefully you do. Hopefully you come up with something else for a sequel that's even better. But that doesn't mean that the game that you made wasn't amazing. Because Resident Evil 4, it feels different than the remake. It feels different than pretty much all the games that came after it. But that unique gameplay loop can never be replicated. That gameplay loop is so, I will use the word perfect. It's perfect for what it tried to do. Uh, might as well be perfect. I wouldn't change that for that game. I might do Uncharted for the sake of Uncharted. I might do Vanquish for the sake of Vanquish. But then those games are lacking in some other components that Resident Evil 4 excelled at. So this is an all or nothing category. If you don't have a 9 already, you can't get a 10. You have to start with a 9 before you can get a 10. And if it doesn't do something extra special, then it's probably not a masterpiece. It's gotta do something that's never been done before. All right, it's gotta have some amazing synergy for me to get a 10 out of 10. Probably, because it's the observation that I make. Almost every game I give a 10 out of 10 to. You know, Elden Ring didn't invent any one element in particular, but put them all together in a way that has never been done before. You know, one of the best open world games, in my opinion, taking that gameplay and taking those storytelling devices and up a notch, because they were all pretty unique individually. Putting them all together, that's probably a 10 out of 10. So either it has to do something that's never been done before, quite literally, or it has to have pretty much perfect synergy. Uh, and that's how you get a 10 out of 10. So if you don't check off all the boxes, you have to have some articulation, some real thought put into it if you're going to get, indeed, any points at all for a game. All right, so you could even start with a 10 and work your way backwards and say, does it do everything perfectly? You gotta start. You can start at the bottom or start at the top. But if you're not checking off the boxes, I don't want to go off of emotion anymore. Oh, I really like the game, so that's the difference between an 8 and a 9. It kind of ends up being that way, but you can think about it logically too. You can articulate it, and if you can articulate it in a certain way, then that's the way it is.
Don't forget this feeling. Your power's incredible, Joker.